So this very simple thing like constipation, if you can start addressing that and make sure you're moving the waste out of your body, maybe you never get Parkinson's, because that waste sitting in there is producing a toxic load. So kind of back to the different kinds of bacteria, many of them that are causing problems are what are called gram-negative, and their cell walls produce something called an endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, and that's very inflammatory. So if it's sitting in your colon or your small bowel, it is producing those toxins and your body is having to deal with them repeatedly.
Welcome to Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm your host, Jenn Trepeck, talking wellness and weight loss for real life. We're here to clear up the myths, misinformation, bad science, and marketing to teach you how to eat and how to cheat. Are you ready? I'm having salad with a side of fries. Hey friend, welcome back to Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm Jenn Trepeck, your host and health coach here with you every week for Wellness Without the Weirdness. And if you're a longtime listener or you've been to one of my seminars, you know that I am, let's say, hypersensitive about claims that we make and what we are frankly legally allowed to say, especially about disease states and especially when it comes to supplements. And every now and then, I am introduced to someone whose research is particularly compelling about a specific disease. And today's guest is one of those people. And what makes it even more exciting is that it is perfectly fitting for April being Parkinson's Awareness Month. So let's get right to it. She's a microbiome researcher and health innovator focused on how gut health, blood sugar balance, and environmental exposures influence chronic disease. She is the founder of the BioCollective, a microbiome research organization dedicated to large-scale analysis of the gut microbiome and its role in metabolic and inflammatory conditions. After her husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, she left a successful corporate career to better understand the biological roots of chronic illness. Her work explores how disruptions in the gut microbiome can drive inflammation, insulin resistance, and neurological decline. She explores how restoring microbial balance may support long-term health. She's also the founder of Prebiotics, a science-based probiotic company, and the developer of Sugar Shift, a patented probiotic clinically shown to reduce endotoxin levels and improve insulin sensitivity. In addition, she's a partner in Ancient Organic Biosciences, where her work bridges soil health and human health through innovative microbial solutions. Her research collaborations include Caltech, the University of Chicago, and the University College Cork. She's received a $1.2 million NIH grant. She's spoken at the White House Microbiome Initiative, delivered a widely viewed TEDx talk, and currently serves as a research fellow at the Australian National University. She's also co-author of multiple peer-reviewed scientific publications. Now she joins us on Salad with a Side of Fries. Please meet Martha Carlin.
Thanks so much, Jen.
Thank you. I am thrilled to have you here. And we heard a little bit of your story in introducing you. We'll use that as our jumping off point after we tell our members what they're getting this week. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, friends, join us in the Happy Healthy Hub. Being a member of the Hub is the next best thing to working with me as your health coach. You get a recipe each week delivered to your inbox, curated articles, additional discounts from me and our partners. You get interview episodes like this one in full video, including some behind the scenes content, and access to the community board where we can interact, ask and answer questions, and so much more. All of this is yours for just $12 a month. Or pay for a year at once and you get 2 months free. So a year for $120. So your recipe this week is for lemony shrimp with white beans. The meal is, I know, I see your face. The meal is protein and fiber in 30 minutes. The recipe has 3 steps. So beyond simple, it's super delicious. And our members are also getting 10% off from Prebiotics, Martha's brand of probiotics. So to get this recipe, 10% off from Prebiotics, plus this episode in full video, access to our community chat where you can ask me anything, connect with each other, and more, go to asaladwithasideoffries.com/membership. From there, you'll click subscribe now, follow the prompts to enter your payment info, create your login to access the hub and all of your benefits. Remember, you're going to to asaladwithasideofries.com/membership. This supports your health and, of course, this show, so we can keep doing this together every week. Okay, Martha, in introducing you, we heard that your husband's Parkinson's diagnosis led you down the road of researching the microbiome. So will you draw that line for us? How did the one take you to the other?
Sure. So my husband was diagnosed in 2002 when he was 44. So very young, healthy, marathon running, young father. It didn't make any sense to me. And my background actually was as an accountant and an auditor. So you're trained as an auditor to never take anything at face value, to examine the evidence for yourself. So I started down this path of trying to understand how or why somebody that young could get Parkinson's. And I started with the food, and he at the time was drinking a soy protein shake every day for about 2 years leading up to that. Now, I'm not saying that's the cause of his Parkinson's, but I think it was a very important clue that led me into looking at food and the toxins in food and glyphosate, which, maybe we can talk about that later. But most of the soy at that time, by that time, 97% of it was GMO and was using glyphosate on it. So I spent about 10 years really digging into food, changing our diet. It improved his tremor. So his tremor was no longer visible. And so I was like, okay, you can make these lifestyle changes and it's going to have an impact on your symptoms. And in 2014, I read a book by Martin Blaser called Missing Microbes. And he was talking about this thing called the microbiome. I'm like, what's that? And the rise in chronic disease after the onset of a discovery of antibiotics. And that really clicked for me because I also knew John had a history of taking antibiotics. And many other people with Parkinson's that I had talked to had a similar type history. And so I started digging into the microbiome. About 6 months later, the first paper was published showing you could divide the two different types of Parkinson's by specific gut bacteria. And I was like, that's it. This gut is like the general ledger. I quit my job and started funding research at the University of Chicago with Jack Gilbert, who later became my co-founder of the BioCollective, along with Dr. Suzanne Vernon. And we were talking about the fact that the gut is connected across all these different diseases. The Human Microbiome Project had just finished, and that was a multi-institutional 5-year study looking at the microbiome in different parts of the body and different age groups in babies and adults. And we were seeing these connections across diseases. And we thought, well, let's build a bank of stool samples of the population and make them available for scientists to do early research. And we can do genetic sequencing and look at the data ourselves and start to uncover all of these different connections. So, I went from a business turnaround person. I mean, it wasn't a fast process because that was 14 years, I think, before I founded the company. But that's how I got into it. And it's connected to so many things. It's so underappreciated, but at least now people know the word microbiome. Most of the time, if I say that to people, they kind of understand what it is. But back in 2015, when I founded the company, nobody really knew what it was.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because I want to go back to something you said, is that the two different types of Parkinson's had very different microbiome makeup profile. Yes. Yeah. And so tell us more about that. Like, what is it that you're seeing in all of these stool samples that you connected? What is that difference? What do we need to know?
Well, so it is interesting. Since that time, there have been about 2,000 papers on Parkinson's and the microbiome, and a lot of them showing different kinds of disruption. So they're not all identical. And one of the things I early on started looking at was, okay, who's there and what could they possibly be doing that could be causing a problem? So there was a group from Finland who showed a strain of bacteria called Desulfovibrio, and that is a hydrogen sulfide producer. And they came out with a headline that was like, this is the cause of Parkinson's. And I had so many people calling me and I was like, you can't really say that. What we see is the whole ecosystem is out of balance. And so it's not one organism or one thing. It's more like this system or cascade of collapse. But probably the biggest eureka out of all of our stuff is my team came to me and they said, out of all the samples we collect, we can tell a Parkinson's person just by looking at their sample. And I was like, what? And they're like, it's like concrete. Well, that had never been published. And fast forward to today, I just have a paper coming out with Dr. Barry Ninham from Australia. And this concrete stool is a foundational early sign of actually what's happening to our internal system. So in order for the nerves to move to get a stool to come out, I mean, you have to have a signal in the nerves. And that is connected to the balance of sodium and potassium. And this battle in the gut between the microbes when they kill each other is spilling out potassium and calcium into the gut. And that calcium makes the concrete stool. And the potassium so you need sodium to propagate the signal. So this very simple thing like constipation that we've normalized is actually something 10, 15, 20 years beforehand. If you can start addressing that and make sure you're moving the waste out of your body, maybe you never get Parkinson's because that waste sitting in there is producing a toxic load. So kind of back to the different kinds of bacteria, many of them that are causing problems are what are called gram-negative, and their cell walls produce something called an endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, and that's very inflammatory. So if it's sitting in your colon or your small bowel, it is producing those toxins and your body is having to deal with them repeatedly. And there are animal models, not only in Parkinson's, but in depression, in autism, in diabetes, all of those related to endotoxin. So I think this really underappreciated simple thing like going to the bathroom every day and removing the waste is one of the most critical things that seems to be just missing.
Yeah. And I want to talk more about that in a second, but there's so many things going through my mind. I think, we did an episode called America's Fiber Problem, and we talked a lot about how people are not eliminating and that sort of reabsorption of the toxins as the stool is sort of sitting there. And then you just mentioned that it connects to not just Parkinson's, but autism and a whole host of other chronic, we could call them conditions. So we understand, and we've talked a lot on this show about the connection between the gut and the brain and the vagus nerve and some of those kinds of things. But I'd love to hear how you explain that connection between what's happening in the gut with the microbiome or even stool sitting there and the endotoxins, and then how we end up with the expression of these diseases neurologically.
Well, okay. So another piece of the puzzle that's really been missing from the science is something called the glycocalyx. So this is a structure in the body. It surrounds everything, every cell. It's lining your gut. When it was originally discovered, the focus was around your blood vessels, but it's actually everywhere. And if you think about cells and the cell membrane is very tiny. It's like 2 to 3 nanometers. But this glycocalyx, the glycocalyx and the little hairs that stick up out of it, called the endothelial surface layer, that is anywhere from hundreds to 1,000 nanometers. So way bigger than the cell membrane. So all of this activity that's going on, the sorting of electrolytes or keeping out toxins or allowing toxins in, that barrier, all of that is this glycocalyx. And that's just been completely missing from the science. But the waste sitting there damages the glycocalyx. Electrolyte imbalance will damage it. Some of the bacteria, H. pylori is one that we've looked at in Parkinson's, and that produces an enzyme called urease. That also can damage it. So it's a very significant piece of the puzzle. And it's also, in our paper, we're talking about the fact that what surrounds the nerves and the myelin sheath is actually this structure.
The glycocalyx.
Yes. It's a continuous structure that shape shifts so that it can allow things in and out of the cell.
It's so interesting. So essentially, it's damage to that sort of barrier, the structure of that barrier that's creating the challenge throughout the whole system.
Yes. And also, if you think about it, depending on what your problem is, it can be a very local phenomenon, but it can also spread and propagate the damage throughout the body. So could be a localized cardiovascular problem or a larger scale one. It could be a localized gut problem, but it can also spread. The damage can spread. So then, you end up with a neurological problem or a neurological and a cardiovascular problem. And, this was actually a connection I didn't make so my husband, John, passed away in September of 2024 from a pulmonary embolism. And, most people don't think connection of pulmonary embolism and Parkinson's, but there actually is a connection. And one of the centers that exercise center he helped put in place in Colorado, was talking to the executive director a few months ago. And she said, I've had 5 people in the last year with Parkinson's at our center actually have a sudden cardiac event like John had. And there's been no connection made to that. But again, it goes back to this glycocalyx and what's happening in those structures.
And so can you also speak to, because when we think about Parkinson's and the gut, my brain goes to dopamine, right?
Well, that's really interesting too, because H. pylori actually eats dopamine. So there's some research out of Harvard that was really interesting showing that, so you have people who are taking dopamine medication and it stops working or they have more problems. And there's this connection to having H. pylori, because if you think about if H. pylori eats dopamine and you take more oral dopamine, then you're feeding one of the main problems that is causing the downstream effects.
Yeah. It's just, it's so logical when you talk about it in this way, but I think it's also very clear that understanding the role of the gut and these different bacteria has been so misunderstood for so long. And I think now too, I'm curious to hear your perspective, because now there are so many people who claim to be microbiome experts, right? So how do you, or what do you want people to know in terms of understanding some of the different markers and translating that for themselves?
So I do get a lot of times people should I get a microbiome test? And most of the time I tell people, no, it's probably not going to do you a great deal of benefit to have this table of all these different organisms. We used to do it. We gave people a report that was 60 pages long. They would take it to their doctor whose eyes would cross because, most medical training doesn't include anything about the microbiome. Now, you do get that training in some of the functional medicine and some of the health coaching and all of that, but still, it's a very nascent field of trying to look at that. And often what you get is people who will say, okay, well, there are these pathogens, let's give you an antibiotic. But that has, back to Dr. Blazer's book about missing microbes, that has other downstream effects, the taking a killing approach. So I like to tell people it's really, you need to focus on elimination, on providing the raw materials that help you build a healthy glycocalyx, and making sure that your toxic burden is low. You've got to lower your toxic burden. And, there's a lot of toxic things in our environment, but there's some simple things you can do by filtering your water or, not eating or microwaving stuff in plastic, or things that you can avoid and make conscious choices about. We're actually getting ready to start a little Parkinson's study with 30 people taking a product for the glycocalyx called Revasca and taking a humic fulvic mineral supplement from Beam Minerals, which does some of that detoxification, and taking our sugar shift formula, which helps restore the healthy ecosystem of the gut and restore an anaerobic state so that your bifidobacteria and some of the other bugs that can't grow in a gut that has oxygen come back. So you get a healthier profile and it drops that endotoxin load. So we're going to see what kind of results we get over 90 days. We have a few people who've tried it and have reported back to us some positive results, but we're taking it a step at a time. But I think trying to look at a list of a bunch of different bugs, and I mean, you could do it because that's what I did. I was looking at every one. And what I did was I just looked at what's on the list and went and looked at all the research and said, okay, well, if I have this bug in my gut, and I know if I have an acute infection with that, it gives me X, Y, or Z. I had this whole table. And what I could actually tell from that is why Parkinson's is what my husband called a designer disease. One person can have these 5 symptoms, and this person will only have 2 symptoms that overlap, and they have 4 other symptoms that don't overlap. And so I could tell that by looking at the different microbes, at what their acute symptoms are. You just have this mixed, complex co-infection, I would say.
So,
that your immune system is not really kicking out. And over time, the research shows that basically the Parkinson's immune system becomes fatigued from trying to fight something. And I think that's a case in a lot of things. And I have another, back to the toxic burden, I have another paper coming out with Dr. Ninham on what are called Quaternary ammonium compounds, but they're basically in cleaning products. And our exposure to these cleaning products that contain these compounds has more than doubled since COVID, because we're germaphobes and they actually incorporate into your membranes and disrupt your immune system and its ability to kick things out. So it's counterintuitive that this over cleaning is actually messing with our immune system. And that's also connected to Parkinson's.
Yeah. So I have follow-up questions in terms of causation and correlation. I want to ask you about B vitamins. And then, of course, going back to something you started to touch on, which is what we can do right now to live our lives protecting against neurodegenerative disease later. So we'll come back for that after we highlight our partner for this episode. I want to share something a reader wrote that stopped me in my tracks. And it's somebody who read my book, Uncomplicating Wellness. He said, I can literally say Jenn saved my life. I went from an A1C of over 11 to 6.1 with her guidance, techniques, and motivation. Here's the thing. That's not a fad. That's also not about living perfectly. It's fundamentally about understanding how your body works, then making steady, sustainable shifts that compound over time. My book, Uncomplicating Wellness, is not extreme. It's not a reset. It's not a detox. What it is clear, practical guidance rooted in science and in real life, so you can make changes that last. So if you're ready to feel informed instead of intimidated and empowered instead of overwhelmed, text the word book, BOOK, to 833-801-0500. We'll send you a link to learn more and where to purchase. Again, text the word book, BOOK, to 833-801-0500. Okay, Martha, you mentioned with the stool samples and the gut and all of these things that you can see, how much of this is a correlation versus a causal relationship?
Well, I think there's a fundamental problem that we're looking for a single cause.
Fair.
So kind of back to, the Glycocalyx. We are a self-assembled structure. And when we start having all these different assaults and problems, the structure starts to become unstable. And so, every time someone sends me a paper like, oh, look at this Parkinson's paper, look at that Parkinson's paper, this could be the cause. Even when you talked about the B vitamins, the B vitamin paper, it's actually a meta-analysis. And one of our papers on the Parkinson's microbiome from our cohort is in there. And okay, B vitamins are made by gut bacteria in your gut. So if you don't have a healthy gut, you're not able to make the B vitamins. And so just the core of a healthy gut And healthy food with micronutrients is kind of one of the keys. But most of the time I'm looking at something and somebody's sending me and they're saying, oh, this is the cause or this is correlated. Well, I mean, you can correlate lots of things. And I've certainly done that myself in digging through the research, and I write about it sometimes on my blogs. But I will always say, this is a factor because we are a complex system. And what's really happening over time is the system is becoming unstable.
Right. And I think I would just want to, highlight your point about it sort of being multifactorial, that it's not one specific thing, but what happens as a result of a handful of things over time. And I have to think also over time that sort of continued assault, that it's not, as we, shift to talk about things that we can do, it's not once in a while eating things that, have been sprayed with glyphosate or traveling occasionally and having that travel constipation. It's a function of what's happening all the time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I mean, I'll give you another example from John. So John was a marathon runner. He was an athlete. Well, I started looking deeply into endurance athletics after having some conversations with the founder of Perfect Aminos, who is an Ironman. And we were talking about insulin sensitivity, and I started digging deeper into, what's happening in endurance athletics. Well, there's a major connection to leaky gut and endurance athletics. So what happens when you are, out on a long run? So the blood is moving out into the muscles. It's moving away from the gut and out into the muscles so that you can continue on. And not only that, they're loading electrolytes, kind of swinging from one direction to the other. So instead of in this homeostasis, they're dehydrated or overhydrated. But what happens when you've been on a long run and then you stop, the blood rushes back to the gut. And when that happens, you get reperfusion injury. Well, reperfusion injury, again, is injuring that glycocalyx. So the fact that he had been a marathon runner and long distance athlete from the time he was in high school all the way up to even a few years after he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, that sort of pounding endurance type workout is not great for the system because you're constantly swinging it too far in one direction.
Right. It's living in these extremes.
Yes. As opposed to doing, exercise is great because exercise also was incredibly beneficial for my husband when he got involved in biking and boxing and some of these other types of things, but not doing the heavy duty endurance type athletics.
Yeah. So I want to go to this electrolyte piece as we shift into things that we can all do and start doing now. I think electrolyte drinks now, all the ones that are out there are not all the same. And, we have a number of nutrition nuggets analyzing various ones. What's your feeling on sort of using these as tools and then sort of living in those vacillating extremes?
Well, after John had COVID, his tight window of homeostasis was not nearly as wide. And we started to see with electrolyte drinks that he was using that they would swing him too far in one direction or another. So trying to figure out if an electrolyte has the right kind of balance. And because too much potassium in the gut lumen is going to disrupt that signaling, that's also kind of a very important piece of the puzzle. And I can't say that I have a great answer for that yet. But what we did find is going back to the research in 1912, the cure, I'm going to say, for constipation, but one of the best remedies for constipation in the literature was actually kosher salt in warm water first thing in the morning. So a little bit of kosher salt, squeeze a lemon, drink that. And I have actually been telling people with Parkinson's to do that the first thing when they get up in the morning, and your bowels will move because it has the sodium to propagate the signal.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because also as I think about over the years, what a bad rap sodium has gotten. And then again, the difference between, what we know of like
salts.
Exactly. Really mineral dense salt versus, table salt and those kinds of things. So you gave us one right now. So starting the day, warm water, lemon, salt, high quality salt.
Yeah.
As we think about going back to what you talked about before in terms of ensuring that we are eliminating regularly, 2 questions on that. One is tips for that in addition to the warm water with lemon, but then also what do you qualify as regularly?
Well, I tell people to think about if you have a dog, how often does your dog go? So your dog is going every day, twice a day sometimes. If you just think about the fact that you're putting food in, chewing it up, swallowing, if it's not coming out the other end after you're eating, like just think about how that stacks up and builds up if you're not going. I mean, it kind of blew my mind because I was looking at TED Talks about pooping, actually.
Uh-huh.
I have a new book called My Search for the Perfect Poop, and it has a lot of poop stories in it to try to get people to understand how important this is. There was a TEDx talk from a GI doctor saying that going once every 3 or 4 days was normal. Well,
Woof.
I'm like, okay, well, that might be normal for people these days, but that's not natural.
Right.
It's
It's
not
normal.
optimal.
That's creating the situation of all of these diseases.
Right. And just going back again to my husband, John, he was constipated from the time he was a baby when he was little. So he remembers when he was 3 or 4 years old, his mother had these stuffed animals all around the top of the cabinets in the kitchen. And she would give him a stuffed animal if he would poop because he wouldn't poop. And so like if you think, people who've had a lifetime of constipation issues, then they do think it's normal,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not optimal.
Yeah. So we have the fluid balancing with the minerals, the salt, the warm water with lemon. Fiber certainly must play into that. What are some of your recommendations there?
So fiber does play into that, but you also have to be careful with fiber if you're not properly hydrated and you haven't started to get things moving. Because if you have a lot of built up waste in there and then you
add bulk,
add more fiber on top of it, it can create more of a problem. So it's better to try to get things moving first before you layer on fiber. And, I'm actually working on a fiber supplement that's designed to have very targeted fibers to feed different bacteria, because that was a really interesting thing I learned at a conference, probably 7 or 8 years ago, where they were showing how different fibers selectively feed different bacteria in the gut. And so you want to be feeding this profile of the good bacteria. And you could do that also with polyphenols. Those are also great for feeding the beneficial bacteria.
And as we're talking about that, there's also a piece, sort of the postbiotic going throughout the whole GI tract.
Yes. So I do talk about that a lot because people will say, oh, well, probiotics, prebiotics, bacteria have action all the way through the gut. And they actually make prebiotics, which are sugars or carbohydrates, fibers. And they make all of these downstream postbiotics. So it's
the short chain fatty acids and those other pieces.
Yep. Moving through the GI tract, there's lots of action going on together with the microbes working together and the things they're using and producing. And the short chain fatty acids, butyrate is actually one of the very, very critical ones for feeding that lining of the gut, for feeding the glycocalyx and that whole layer in there. Those cells need butyrate.
What else do you recommend for sort of supporting the proper structure and shape of the glycocalyx?
Well, so the glycocalyx is actually made of hyaluronic acid primarily, which is an animal fiber. Like people don't think of it as a fiber, but it is an animal fiber. It's also interesting in our aging microbiome data, we found that as people were aging, they were losing the precursors in the gut bacteria that were making precursors for hyaluronic acid. And then the little fuzzy hairs that stand up the endothelial surface layer, that's all sulfated polymers. So it's keratin sulfate, chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate. Well, seaweed is actually a great source of those sulfated polymers. And to me, that probably explains a little bit of the Japanese health kind of trend where, they talk about better longevity and all that, because they eat a lot more seaweed or foods with these sulfated polymers. And I was actually doing some research with a group in the northern part of Australia because the Aboriginal population there has trouble with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And so we're looking at doing a study with them. And I went back and looked at what they used to eat before they moved to, the very highly processed Western diet. And all these foods they were eating, they were all foods that were feeding the glycocalyx.
So interesting. So the Western diet, our Western life practices. Let's go back to sort of the glyphosate piece, because part of the impact there is that it binds minerals, right? So that we can't absorb them, correct?
Yes.
So what are some of your recommendations for helping people live their lives with leaning toward that prevention, understanding where those coming from and what we could do about it?
So, well, first and foremost, try to eat organic as much as possible. And there's a list, I think you can get it from the Environmental Working Group, of like 60 different crops where they spray at the end of harvest to dry the crop. And that to me is an even bigger problem than, where it's sprayed at the beginning. Because if it's sprayed at the beginning, there's more time for the plant to deal with it and try to detoxify it. But if it's sprayed at the end, I think that's why we have so many problems with grains, or people have problems with legumes, because it's an antibiotic. So it's also killing the good gut bacteria you need to do all these processes. So I tell people, if they can, try to eat organic. Some of the humic fulvic acids can help with glyphosate. I know a couple of the different groups, I think ION has done some research on that, and B Minerals has also done some research on that. And then actually our sugar shift formula, well, we designed it initially to convert sugars, but we selected microbes, lactobacillus species, that were resistant to glyphosate, because most of those lactobacillus are killed by glyphosate. And so what we found, we just actually got a white paper done in laboratory showing that in 24 hours, the sugar shift probiotic eliminated 27% of the glyphosate and its breakdown product, AMPA. So again, if you have a healthy gut microbiome, you can do that. But, we made a formula because most people don't. Another thing is actually apple cider vinegar with the mother, because the mother is actually an Acetobacter bacteria, and that bacteria can also break down glyphosate.
Fascinating. Who knew? So last piece is in terms of thinking about other lifestyle factors. I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of stress in the gut and Parkinson's and some of these pieces. So I turn it to you.
Well, so we actually started doing a interview series. We haven't put it out yet, but it's called Voices of Parkinson's. And we wanted people with Parkinson's to tell their stories, because they don't, like, you go to the doctor, you get 15 minutes. No, they don't want to hear your story. They don't want to hear why you think you got Parkinson's. And so we started just interviewing people and letting them talk and tell us their stories. And we found this just incredible connection that I can't believe, all the years of looking at this, I hadn't made the connection before, that a tremendous amount of stress typically preceded the diagnosis. It could have been a building lifetime stress, but oftentimes it was loss of a parent, loss of a child, a major chronic illness with a child, an accident with a child, a divorce, a loss of a business, all of these stressors that, we don't think about. Well, the chronic stress also affects our minerals in our body. It's this whole cascade of things that you don't think about when you're not dealing with these stressors. And the biggest one of all, though, was grief, like trapped grief that hadn't been dealt with. And so there's a lot of emotional components to what happens to us physically and how that kind of cascades. And this gut-brain connection. So, you're producing neurotransmitters in your gut. They go to your brain. You get this loop going. And so all of these emotional aspects also affect the bacteria in the gut. And then that, creates that loop again in the brain.
Yeah. It's so powerful. And, one of the things that's really sticking with me from everything we've talked about is how much we overlook and dismiss little signs and things that are happening all the time until we get to this massive diagnosis that feels like it came out of nowhere, but we can connect the dots and see how we got there.
Absolutely. In fact, this was another kind of interesting little thing that I learned from a group of wives of men who had Parkinson's that I didn't know, was that many of them wore prism glasses. So like the first sign was, one of them was telling the story, her husband would hit a golf ball. He played golf, and he would hit a golf ball and it would disappear from his vision. And this prism glasses are like the eyes aren't tracking together. And it's a very underappreciated connection with Parkinson's. So then I started asking everybody I would talk to, do you wear prism glasses? And I was just shocked by the number of people who wore prism glasses. And
wow,
I always had this feeling that like John wasn't seeing what I was seeing. And like, maybe that's like, when you send your husband to the refrigerator to find something and they say it's not there, maybe they don't really see it. But that's just another one of those little things that could be an early sign that maybe you could make more lifestyle changes and turn things around.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Martha, a final thought, something to wrap this up?
Well, I like to let people know you can have hope. So you get that bomb dropped on you, and this really frustrates me because it's 20 some odd years since John was diagnosed. And we were so frustrated at how that bomb was dropped on us. And we were told, there's really nothing you can do. We can manage the symptoms, but it's, straight line down. And it's just not true. There are so many things that you can do to change the trajectory of your health and not think of it as like a death sentence. I mean, none of us is getting out of here alive. So like, go live your life. But there's so many things that you can take action to make a difference, whether it's exercise, whether it's kicking out the sugar and the processed foods, or filtering your water, or if you're an endurance athlete, maybe switching to something that's not quite so hard on your body. I mean, just definitely get it going, like get the poop going. That's like number one on the list. And if you start to do these little things one at a time, I think you'll be amazed, and you can have hope that it's not all bad.
Yes, for sure. All right. It is time for our rapid fire off topic questions. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right.
I hope.
Right. It's good. It's good. What's the best thing you've done for your health this week? What's the naughtiest thing you've done related to your health this week? The salad and fries of your week.
Okay. Well, so the best thing I did is I went and had acupuncture for my shoulder, which I had hurt doing yoga. And then the worst thing is, my son and his family came to visit, and they left a tub of vanilla ice cream in the freezer and chocolate sauce. And I actually made a little mini chocolate milkshake for myself.
Sounds delicious.
It was great.
If you weren't a researcher and founder of Biotics, what would you do?
I would just travel the world.
I hear you. Your favorite book on any topic other than your area of expertise? Or you could give us a fiction book.
Well, one of my favorite books of all time is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And I love the little phrase in there about one sees clearly only with the heart. Anything is essential is invisible to the eyes. And that's been a love of mine since I took French in high school. But over and over and over again, it proves to be true.
Love that. If you could cure one ailment, disease, or sickness, what would it be?
Parkinson's.
I could have guessed. If you were a superhero, what would be your superpower?
I would fly.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
Just the way the whole system works. And it's very hard if you're an outsider. It doesn't matter what the system is, whether it's science or business or, it's just very hard to break into the system. So, I work outside the system, but the system is my pet peeve.
I hear you. All right, last one. In your opinion, what's the next frontier in wellness?
The next frontier in wellness is the Glycocalyx.
Love it. Well, Martha Carlin, thank you for being here. Tell everybody how to connect, where to find all of your incredible products and resources.
So you can find me at our website, biotiquest.com. That's BIOTIQUEST.com. And I write a blog there mostly on gut health, but I cover some other topics occasionally. I also have a Parkinson's blog called Martha's Quest and a Substack that is also called Martha's Quest. And on Substack, I write on broader environmental issues, and on the marthasquest.com, I write specifically about Parkinson's and give ideas for, exercise, diet, those types of things, and microbiome related research papers.
Love it. And we'll put links to everything in the episode notes. So thank you again. Just truly appreciate your time, your expertise, and how you explain everything for all of us to be able to understand it. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, friends, on Friday in this week's bite-sized bonus episode, we're talking about Form bars. So these are another protein bar that commandeered my Instagram feed. So once again, I added it to our list. They say they are the bar that raises the bar. So we'll see if they're worth the hype on Friday in this week's bite-sized bonus episode. So be sure, wherever you're listening, click the plus sign or the follow button, and then your app will alert you when the Nutrition Nugget goes live on Friday morning. Well, as always, everybody, I'm Jenn Trepeck. Connect with me on Instagram or all social media. I'm at Jenn Trepeck, JENNTREPECK. Website is asaladwithasideofries.com. Pick your platform, send a message. I love hearing from you, your takeaways, your ideas, your questions. This is also the easiest way to learn more about working with me as your coach. Martha Carlin, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, likewise. And friends, if you are not already, join us in the Happy Healthy Hub. You'll go to asaladwithasideofries.com/membership. This shows your support for this podcast, this community, and most importantly, your health. On top of this week's episode in full video with some behind the scenes pieces and your 24/7 Ask Me Anything in the community board, you'll get this week's recipe for the lemony shrimp with white beans and 10% off from BioCollective, Martha's brand of probiotics. So until next week, we've known the gut and the brain are connected. Now we know that taking care of our microbiome today can help prevent neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's later. Well, friends, that's it for today's episode of Salad with a Side of Fries. Congratulations for making yourself and your health a priority. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to click subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform. Share us with a friend, and we'll be back next week. Always remember, you deserve it, and you are worth it. Happy healthy.